So we have another lying witness who thinks she can waste this court's time with fairy tales about blood spatter? Judge Marcus Thornfield's voice cuts through the packed courtroom like a blade, dripping with contempt as he glares down from his elevated bench. The black woman in the witness stand sits with her hands folded calmly in her lap, seemingly unmoved by the hostility radiating from the man in the black robes. Brenna Vale's composed demeanor only seems to fuel his irritation further. The courtroom holds its collective breath. This is the murder trial of Carlos Hernandez, accused of killing 23-year-old Keisha Washington in what prosecutors claim was a brutal robbery gone wrong. The victim's mother, Diana Washington, clutches a tissue in the front row, her eyes fixed on the woman who might hold the key to justice for her daughter. Your Honor, I'm simply testifying to what I observed while cleaning the crime scene the night after the incident. Brenna's voice remains steady, professional. There's something about her tone that suggests years of experience speaking in formal settings, though her modest appearance tells a different story. She wears the simple uniform of courthouse maintenance staff, her hair pulled back neatly, no jewelry except for a plain watch on her wrist. Cleaning? You mean mopping blood and emptying trash? Thornfield's laugh is harsh, designed to humiliate. And you expect this jury to believe you understand forensic evidence better than our certified medical examiner? Defense attorney Wade Crenshaw shifts uncomfortably at his table, while prosecutor Rex Dalton looks stunned by the judge's open hostility. The 12 jurors exchange uncertain glances, clearly disturbed by what they're witnessing. This isn't how justice is supposed to work. But Brenna doesn't flinch. The blood spatter patterns don't match Dr. Morrison's autopsy report, Your Honor. The trajectory angles are inconsistent with the alleged murder weapon. A murmur ripples through the gallery. Mrs. Washington leans forward, hope flickering in her tired eyes. How does a cleaning lady know about trajectory angles and blood spatter analysis? The precision of Brenna's language suggests knowledge that goes far beyond what anyone would expect from courthouse maintenance staff. Trajectory angles? From a janitor who probably never finished high school? Thornfield's racist assumption hangs in the air like poison, and several jurors visibly recoil from his words. But something in Brenna's steady gaze hints at depths no one has yet fathomed. Her next words carry the weight of scientific certainty. The victim's wounds show defensive patterns inconsistent with the prosecution's timeline, Your Honor. The courtroom erupts in whispers. Court reporter Emma Sterling's fingers fly across her keyboard, capturing every word of this unprecedented exchange. Judge Thornfield's face reddens as he realizes this simple janitor might be about to expose something he's worked very hard to keep buried. The gavel crashes down with thunderous force, but this is just the beginning of a revelation that will shake the very foundations of this courthouse. The morning had started like any other murder trial in Cook County. The courthouse buzzed with the familiar energy of journalists, attorneys, and family members seeking justice. The case seemed straightforward enough. Carlos Hernandez, a 28-year-old construction worker, stood accused of murdering Keisha Washington during what prosecutors called a robbery attempt in downtown Chicago. But as Brenna Vale was sworn in as a witness, an undercurrent of tension began building in courtroom 7. She had requested to testify about discrepancies she'd noticed while cleaning the crime scene area of the courthouse after evidence processing. Most judges would have dismissed such a request from maintenance staff, but federal oversight requirements had mandated that all potential witnesses be heard. Brenna's systematic approach to her testimony immediately caught attention. The way she organized her notes, the methodical manner in which she referenced specific locations and times, the careful precision of her language. These weren't characteristics typically associated with custodial staff. Her modest appearance, the simple maintenance uniform, the practical shoes, the unadorned demeanor, stood in stark contrast to the sophisticated organizational skills emerging from her preparation. The crime scene was processed on Tuesday evening, and I began custodial duties Wednesday at 11 p.m., she explained to Prosecutor Dalton during direct examination. Her habit of checking her watch before speaking suggested someone accustomed to precise scheduling and documentation. During my work, I observed several inconsistencies between the physical evidence and what I'd heard described in court proceedings. Judge Thornfield had interrupted almost immediately. His hostility toward black witnesses in high-profile cases was well documented among court staff, though carefully concealed from appellate review. But this morning felt different, more aggressive, more personal. Objection, Your Honor, Defense Attorney Crenshaw interjected weakly. The witness lacks foundation to comment on forensic evidence. Sustained, Thornfield snapped, his eyes never leaving Brenna. The jury will disregard the witness's speculation about evidence she's not qualified to interpret. But Brenna had only smiled slightly, the expression of someone who knew far more than she was being allowed to say. She arranged her files with military precision, each document placed exactly where it needed to be. That small gesture of perfect organization seemed to unnerve the judge more than any argument could have. The dynamics in the courtroom grew increasingly uncomfortable as the questioning continued. Mrs. Washington watched from the front row with growing interest. Her daughter's case had felt hopeless for months. The police investigation had been perfunctory, the physical evidence hastily processed, and the arrest of Carlos Hernandez had seemed almost too convenient. But this cleaning lady was describing details that even the official investigators had missed. If murder trials like this shock you, wait until you see what we uncover next. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because what happens when judges try to cover up murder will absolutely blow your mind. You won't believe how this ends. Court clerk Vera Blackwell, a woman who had cultivated her position as the courthouse social arbiter for over a decade, watched the proceedings with obvious disdain. She had built her reputation on maintaining the established order, ensuring that people stayed in their proper places. A custodial worker challenging judicial authority represented everything she despised about modern society's lack of respect for hierarchy. The witness should know her place, Blackwell whispered to a colleague during a brief sidebar conference. Some people need to understand that education and breeding matter in legal proceedings. Her words carried the weight of institutional gatekeeping, the kind of social policing that had kept the courthouse functioning according to unwritten rules about who deserved respect and who should remain invisible. But those rules were about to be tested in ways Blackwell couldn't imagine. Medical examiner Dr. Clark Morrison, seated in the gallery, shifted uncomfortably as Brenna continued her testimony. His autopsy report had been accepted without question for months. The idea that a courthouse custodian could challenge findings that had required years of medical school and residency training was almost incomprehensible. Yet something about her precise language and systematic approach was triggering professional anxiety he couldn't quite identify. Prosecutor Dalton attempted to redirect the testimony toward what he considered safer ground. Ms. Vale, please limit your comments to what you directly observed, not your interpretation of evidence. Of course, Brenna replied, and then demonstrated knowledge that should have been impossible for her stated position. I observed that the blood evidence had been photographed and cataloged before my cleaning duties began. The crime scene tape was removed at 9:30 p.m. Wednesday. I began work at 11 p.m., allowing the required 90-minute gap for evidence security protocols. Another murmur through the gallery. How did a cleaning lady know about evidence security protocols and required waiting periods? These weren't procedures covered in basic courthouse orientation. They were federal requirements known primarily to law enforcement and legal professionals. Judge Thornfield's irritation visibly grew with each precise reference Brenna made, but he couldn't articulate why her testimony was so disturbing. On the surface, she was simply a custodial worker describing her observations, but the underlying competence and systematic thinking suggested someone with experience in environment science, where precision and protocol adherence were matters of life and death. The morning session continued with mounting tension. Brenna's testimony remained calm and methodical, but each response revealed layers of knowledge that seemed impossible for her stated position. When she mentioned proper chain of custody procedures, several attorneys in the gallery took notice. When she referenced specific federal evidence handling requirements, even the court reporter looked up from her keyboard in surprise. During a brief recess, whispered conversations filled the hallway. Mrs. Washington approached Brenna near the witness preparation room, but the maintenance worker's response was both kind and professionally distant, the demeanor of someone accustomed to maintaining operational boundaries while showing genuine compassion. There's something different about her, Emma Sterling confided to a colleague during the break. The way she sits, the way she organizes her materials, even the way she listens to questions. She's not like any maintenance worker I've met in 20 years of court reporting. Meanwhile, Judge Thornfield huddled briefly with Dr. Morrison and Vera Blackwell in his chambers. Their conversation was hushed but intense, the kind of discussion that suggested more than professional concern about trial proceedings. When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. What had begun as routine questioning of a minor witness had evolved into something far more significant. Brenna returned to the witness stand with the same calm demeanor, but observers noted that she carried herself with a confidence that transcended her humble position. The victim's family sensed that something important was happening, though they couldn't yet understand what. Carlos Hernandez, who had maintained his innocence from the moment of arrest, watched the proceedings with growing hope. His court-appointed attorney had warned him that the case looked hopeless, but this unexpected witness was raising questions no one had asked before. As the afternoon session approached, Judge Thornfield's hostility toward Brenna intensified. His interruptions became more frequent. his tone more openly dismissive. What had started as judicial bias was evolving into something that looked increasingly like fear of exposure. The stage was set for confrontations that would reveal the true scope of corruption in the Cook County justice system, and Brenna Vale was positioned at the center of revelations that would shake the courthouse to its foundations. The transformation began when Prosecutor Dalton made the critical error of asking Brenna to elaborate on the crime scene inconsistencies she'd observed. What followed would begin unraveling a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the county judicial system, though the full scope wouldn't become clear for hours yet to come. The official report states that the victim was found lying on her back with defensive wounds on her arms, Brenna testified, her voice carrying steady authority that seemed to grow stronger with each response. However, the blood evidence I observed indicates she was positioned face down when the fatal wounds were inflicted. Dr. Morrison stood abruptly from his seat in the gallery. Objection! This witness lacks the medical training to make such determinations. He's not even counsel in this case, Defense Attorney Crenshaw pointed out, clearly confused by the medical examiner's outburst. Judge Thornfield sustained the objection anyway, but Brenna continued with measured precision that suggested extensive experience with legal proceedings. I'm simply describing what I observed during evidence cleanup. The blood pooling patterns and spatter analysis are documented in the crime scene photographs. Analysis? Thornfield's voice rose dangerously. You're a janitor, not a forensic expert. Your job is to mop floors, not interpret evidence that trained professionals have already examined. The racist undertone in his words hung heavy in the courtroom air. Several jurors exchanged uncomfortable glances while Mrs. Washington gripped her tissue tighter. But Brenna's response revealed knowledge that would begin the systematic demolition of their carefully constructed lies. I observed specific patterns that suggest the scene was altered between the initial incident and official documentation, she replied calmly. When she reached for her folder, her movements were precise and efficient. Not the hesitant gestures of someone unsure of their materials, but the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to handling crucial documents under pressure. The first piece of evidence she produced should not have existed. Crime scenes were supposed to be processed and cleaned without additional documentation by non-law enforcement personnel. Yet here was a maintenance worker who had not only observed crucial details but had documented them with systematic thoroughness. During my custodial duties, I maintained detailed logs of all areas cleaned, including photographic documentation for insurance and liability purposes, Brenna explained, producing a series of time-stamped photographs. These images show the crime scene area before and after official processing. Speaking of forensic evidence, today's story is sponsored by CrimeScope Pro. When crucial evidence might be tampered with or hidden, you need professional-grade forensic tools to reveal the truth. CrimeScope Pro's portable evidence detection system can uncover blood traces, fingerprints, and DNA evidence that others miss. With lab-quality accuracy in a compact design, justice never has to wait. Use code EVIDENCE20 for 20% off your first forensic kit, because sometimes the evidence speaks louder than lies. The photographs were devastating, though their full implications wouldn't become clear until much later. They showed blood spatter patterns on the eastern wall that were inconsistent with the victim's reported position. More troubling, they captured evidence of scene staging, blood evidence that appeared to have been moved or repositioned before official processing began. Dr. Morrison's professional composure was beginning to crack. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Crime scene documentation should only be conducted by certified forensic technicians. And yet, Brenna responded before the judge could speak, courthouse maintenance protocols require photographic documentation of all biohazard cleanup procedures. These images were taken in compliance with federal occupational safety regulations. Her knowledge of federal regulations was becoming impossible to ignore. Court clerk Vera Blackwell had stopped taking notes and was staring at the witness stand with obvious confusion. How was a cleaning lady citing federal occupational safety regulations with such precision? But it was Brenna's use of language that was most revealing to those trained to notice such things. She spoke in the measured cadences of someone accustomed to giving testimony, used technical terms with casual precision, and referenced legal procedures with the familiarity of extensive experience. Yet she maintained the careful boundaries of someone operating under constraints that weren't immediately apparent. These photographs show clear discrepancies between the scene as I documented it and the official reports that were subsequently filed, she continued, producing additional evidence that would later prove crucial to federal prosecutors. The images told a story that contradicted everything in the official case file. Blood spatter patterns indicated that the victim had been attacked from a different angle than reported. The distribution of evidence suggested that items had been moved or repositioned after the initial incident. Most damaging of all, the photographs showed that key physical evidence had been altered before official forensic processing began. "This is outrageous," Prosecutor Dalton finally exploded. "This witness is essentially accusing law enforcement of evidence tampering based on photographs she took while performing custodial duties." "I'm not accusing anyone," Brenna replied with maddening calm, her hands folded neatly over her documentation. "I'm simply presenting observations that raise questions about the accuracy of official proceedings." But Judge Thornfield had heard enough. His judicial mask was slipping, revealing the corrupt official beneath. "Ms. Vale, your testimony is inappropriate and potentially prejudicial to these proceedings. I'm ordering you to limit your responses to direct observations without interpretation." "Then let me be completely direct," Brenna said, her voice taking on a subtle edge of authority that hadn't been there before. She reached for another folder, her movements deliberate and confident. "The crime scene shows clear evidence of postmortem positioning. The victim was moved after death to create a scene consistent with the prosecution's theory of the case." The courtroom erupted. Mrs. Vaz Washington gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. Carlos Hernandez looked up for the first time in months with something resembling hope. The jury members were leaning forward, hanging on every word. Defense attorney Wade Crenshaw, realizing the significance of what was happening, pressed for more details. "Ms. Vale, you're suggesting that evidence was deliberately falsified?" "I'm documenting specific discrepancies between physical evidence and official reports," Brenna replied diplomatically. "The determination of whether those discrepancies represent error or intentional falsification would be for appropriate authorities to make." Her careful phrasing suggested someone familiar with the boundaries of testimony, someone who understood the difference between observation and conclusion, someone who knew how to present evidence without overstepping legal boundaries. These weren't skills learned in custodial training. The photographs continued to tell their devastating story. Crime scene staging, evidence manipulation, systematic alteration of physical evidence to support a predetermined narrative. The implications reached far beyond this single case into the fundamental integrity of the county justice system. But perhaps most revealing was Brenna's reaction to the mounting hostility. Instead of becoming defensive or intimidated, she seemed to grow more focused and precise. Her responses became more systematic, her documentation more thorough, her presentation more professional. She was responding to pressure the way someone responds when they have extensive experience in high-stakes situations. Judge Thornfield's final error in this phase was attempting to use his judicial authority to suppress evidence that was clearly legitimate. "Ms. Vale, I'm ordering you to cease this line of testimony immediately. You will confine your responses to your direct observations as a custodial worker." "Your Honor," Brenna replied with devastating calm, "I believe my testimony is within the scope of direct observation. I'm describing what I documented during the performance of my assigned duties." The battle lines were being drawn. On one side stood the entire judicial establishment of Cook County, with Judge Thornfield leading the effort to suppress evidence that threatened their carefully constructed case. On the other side sat a single black woman in maintenance workers' clothing, armed with documentation and knowledge that shouldn't exist. But the victim's family was beginning to understand that they might finally be getting answers about their daughter's death. The defendant realized that his protests of innocence might actually be heard, and Judge Thornfield recognized that his worst fears might be coming true. Someone had discovered the truth about Keisha Washington's murder. The afternoon session would prove to be unlike anything Cook County's judicial system had ever witnessed. The afternoon session opened with Judge Thornfield attempting to regain control of his courtroom through sheer force of judicial authority combined with racial intimidation. His strategy was brutal in its simplicity: humiliate the witness into submission through public ridicule and systematic degradation. What he didn't realize was that every word he spoke was revealing the depth of his corruption to observers who were beginning to understand that this was no ordinary trial. "Ms. Vale," Thornfield began, his voice dripping with condescension designed to reduce her to the racial stereotype he preferred, "you've presented this court with photographs and theories that would be laughable if they weren't so disruptive to legitimate legal proceedings. Do you seriously expect a jury of educated citizens to accept forensic analysis from someone whose qualifications extend no further than operating a mop and bucket?" The gallery tensed at the obvious racial subtext. Mrs. Washington's hands clenched into fists, while several jurors looked visibly uncomfortable with their judge's behavior. But Brenna's response revealed another layer of impossible expertise that would begin dismantling their assumptions about her capabilities. "Your Honor, the blood spatter analysis I've documented shows classic characteristics of blunt force trauma with a cylindrical object approximately 2 inches in diameter. She replied with clinical precision that belonged in a medical school lecture hall. The impact patterns indicate a striking angle of 30 to 45 degrees, inconsistent with the hammer alleged in the prosecution's case. Defense attorney Crenshaw nearly dropped his legal pad. Brenna had just provided a textbook description of forensic blood pattern analysis, complete with precise measurements and technical terminology that would have impressed certified expert witnesses. Her language carried the authority of extensive training and practical experience. Court clerk Vera Blackwell's social gatekeeping instincts were in full revolt. This violation of established hierarchy, a custodial worker demonstrating expertise that challenged medical professionals, represented everything she despised about social mobility and changing power structures. "She's getting above herself," Blackwell whispered furiously to a colleague. "Someone needs to put her back in her place." But putting Brenna Vale in her place was becoming increasingly difficult as her testimony revealed depths of knowledge that shouldn't exist. When she referenced specific forensic procedures, her language carried the precision of someone who had not only studied these techniques, but had extensive practical experience applying them in real-world situations. Dr. Morrison could no longer remain silent. "Your Honor, this is a mockery of forensic science. Blood pattern analysis requires years of specialized training and certification. This witness cannot possibly possess the expertise she's claiming." "I'm not claiming expertise," Brenna replied evenly, arranging her documents with the systematic efficiency that was becoming her trademark. "I'm describing what I observed and documented according to standard evidence preservation protocols." But her knowledge went far beyond mere observation. When Prosecutor Dalton attempted to challenge her testimony through cross-examination, Brenna demonstrated familiarity with forensic procedures that revealed extensive professional training. "Ms. Vale, you claim the victim was repositioned after death. How could a cleaning lady possibly make such a determination? The documented lividity patterns show gravitational pooling inconsistent with the body's discovered position," she answered without hesitation, using medical terminology with casual precision. "The observed lividity suggests the victim remained face down for approximately 4 to 6 hours before being repositioned onto her back." The courtroom fell silent. Lividity and gravitational pooling weren't terms commonly known outside forensic pathology. Court reporter Emma Sterling stopped typing mid-sentence, staring at the witness stand in disbelief. Where had a courthouse custodian learned to speak like a medical examiner? But it was Brenna's systematic approach to evidence presentation that was most revealing. She organized her materials with military precision, referenced her documentation with practiced efficiency, and maintained operational boundaries with the discipline of someone accustomed to working under strict protocols. These weren't skills developed in custodial work. Judge Thornfield's hostility escalated to frightening levels as he realized that conventional intimidation wasn't working. "I've had enough of this charade. Ms. Vale, you will limit your testimony to what you directly observed while performing custodial duties, or I will hold you in contempt." "Then let me describe exactly what I observed," Brenna replied, producing another set of photographs that caused Dr. Morrison to pale visibly. These images document the crime scene before official forensic processing. Note the blood spatter patterns on the north wall, showing cast-off evidence from a weapon swung in an upward arc. The prosecution claims the murder weapon was swung downward. The photographs were devastating in their implications. They showed clear evidence that the official crime scene had been altered before forensic documentation began. Blood spatter patterns had been modified, evidence had been moved, and the victim's position had been staged to support a predetermined narrative. But what was most troubling to those who understood investigative procedures was the quality of Brenna's documentation. These weren't amateur photographs taken by curious custodial staff. They were systematic, professionally composed images that followed federal evidence documentation protocols. The lighting, angles, and technical specifications suggested someone with extensive training in forensic photography. Antagonist Bailiff Rex Dalton, a man who had built his reputation on physical intimidation and aggressive enforcement of judicial authority, began positioning himself closer to the witness stand. His presence was designed to create psychological pressure, to remind everyone in the courtroom that judicial power ultimately rested on the threat of physical force. "Your Honor," Dalton interjected with barely concealed aggression, "this witness is disrupting court proceedings with wild theories. Perhaps she needs to be reminded that this is a court of law, not a place for custodial staff to play detective." But Brenna's response demonstrated that physical intimidation was unlikely to be effective. She acknowledged Dalton's presence with a brief glance that assessed and dismissed the threat in a single moment. Her body language remained relaxed, confident, suggesting someone with extensive experience dealing with aggressive individuals. This woman's courage in exposing a murder cover-up is incredible, but she shouldn't have had to face this racist judge alone. If this injustice makes your blood boil like it does mine, smash that like button to show your support for victims seeking real justice. Mrs. Washington was crying openly now, but they were tears of hope rather than despair. For the first time since her daughter's death, someone was presenting evidence that the official story was wrong. Someone was fighting for Keisha's memory with scientific precision and unwavering courage, refusing to be intimidated by judicial authority or racial prejudice. Carlos Hernandez watched the proceedings with growing amazement. He had maintained his innocence from the moment of arrest, but no one had listened. His court-appointed attorney had advised him to accept a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. Now this unexpected witness was methodically dismantling the case against him, with forensic evidence the prosecution had either missed or deliberately ignored. The systematic nature of Brenna's documentation was becoming impossible to ignore. She had spent months collecting evidence, organizing materials, and preparing comprehensive analysis that challenged every aspect of the official investigation. This wasn't the work of a curious custodian who had stumbled across inconsistencies. This was the product of systematic investigation by someone with extensive professional training. Ms. Vale, defense attorney Crenshaw ventured carefully, recognizing that this witness might be his client's only hope for justice. Are you suggesting that evidence in this case was deliberately falsified? I'm documenting discrepancies between observed evidence and official reports. Brenna replied diplomatically, her phrasing careful and legally precise. Whether those discrepancies represent error or intentional falsification would be for appropriate authorities to determine. But her photographs told a story that was impossible to misinterpret. Someone had tampered with the Keisha Washington crime scene to create evidence supporting a predetermined conclusion. The implications reached far beyond this single case into the fundamental integrity of the Cook County judicial system. Judge Thornfield's mask had completely slipped. His next words would later be cited in federal civil rights proceedings as evidence of systematic bias. I don't care what your photographs show, Ms. Vale. In my courtroom, we rely on certified experts, not cleaning ladies with delusions of forensic expertise. The racial animus in his words was unmistakable. Several jurors visibly recoiled, while Mrs. Washington stood up in the gallery, her voice breaking as she spoke. She's the first person who's told the truth about my daughter's death, but the most significant development was occurring outside the direct testimony. Court security cameras were recording everything, creating a permanent record of judicial bias and corruption that would later be used in federal prosecutions. The systematic documentation of civil rights violations was building toward a reckoning that Thornfield couldn't yet imagine. The cross-examination that followed revealed the true scope of knowledge that Brenna had been carefully concealing throughout her testimony. Prosecutor Dalton, operating under increasingly desperate instructions from Judge Thornfield, attempted to destroy her credibility through personal attack and systematic humiliation. Ms. Vale, what is your educational background? I have completed extensive training in evidence preservation and crime scene analysis, she replied carefully, maintaining operational security while hinting at qualifications far beyond her apparent position. Her phrasing was precisely crafted to be technically accurate while revealing nothing about the true source of her expertise. That's not what I asked. What degrees do you hold? What schools did you attend? What certifications have you earned? I have advanced certifications in forensic pathology and federal evidence protocols, Brenna answered, her response revealing extensive formal training while maintaining the boundaries of whatever constraints governed her testimony. The precision of her language suggested someone with experience navigating complex legal and professional requirements. Dr. Morrison had moved to a seat directly behind the prosecution table, clearly coordinating the attack on Brenna's testimony. His whispered conferences with Prosecutor Dalton were becoming obvious enough to draw objections from the defense, but Judge Thornfield was allowing the collaboration to continue. But as the questioning intensified, something unexpected began happening. Instead of becoming defensive or evasive under pressure, Brenna's responses became more precise and professional. Her knowledge of forensic procedures emerged in greater detail. Her familiarity with legal protocols became more apparent, and her systematic approach to evidence analysis revealed training that was clearly extensive and recent. Ms. Vale, you claim expertise in blood pattern analysis. Have you published any peer-reviewed research in forensic journals? Have you testified as an expert witness in other cases? What professional organizations recognize your qualifications? My work has been subject to federal review and validation, she replied, again maintaining operational boundaries while hinting at credentials that were clearly legitimate and extensive. I am not at liberty to discuss specific details of my professional background. The evasiveness of her answers was beginning to intrigue rather than satisfy the questioning. Each response revealed knowledge while concealing credentials, suggesting someone with legitimate expertise who was deliberately maintaining cover for reasons that weren't immediately apparent. Technical challenger prosecutor Dale Merrick entered the courtroom during the cross-examination, bringing additional legal expertise to bear against Brenna's testimony. Merrick was known throughout the county for his ability to destroy witnesses through systematic legal attack, and his presence suggested that the prosecution was escalating their efforts to discredit this unexpected threat. Ms. Vale, Merrick began with practiced aggression. Let's discuss your alleged expertise in forensic pathology. Can you explain the difference between ante-mortem and post-mortem injury patterns? Ante-mortem injuries show evidence of vital response, bleeding, bruising, and tissue reaction that occurs while the victim is alive, Brenna replied without hesitation, demonstrating medical knowledge that belonged in a pathology textbook. Post-mortem injuries lack vital response and show characteristic patterns of tissue damage that occur after death. Merrick's confidence wavered as he realized that this witness possessed genuine expertise that would be difficult to challenge. And how does this supposed knowledge relate to the Keisha Washington case? The victim shows both ante-mortem defensive wounds and post-mortem positioning injuries, Brenna responded with clinical precision. The defensive wounds indicate she fought her attacker. The positioning injuries suggest her body was moved and arranged after death to create a crime scene consistent with the prosecution's narrative. The implications were staggering. Brenna was accusing the entire prosecution team of building their case around a crime scene that had been deliberately staged. She was suggesting that Keisha Washington's body had been manipulated after death to create false evidence against Carlos Hernandez. Dr. Morrison could no longer maintain his professional facade. This is preposterous. This witness has no credible forensic training. She's making accusations that undermine months of professional investigation and analysis. Then perhaps, Brenna replied calmly, the investigation and analysis should be subjected to independent review. Her suggestion carried implications that terrified everyone involved in the cover-up. Independent review would expose the systematic falsification of evidence, the coordination between judge and medical examiner, and the deliberate framing of an innocent man for political convenience. Judge Thornfield attempted to escalate the intimidation through direct judicial threat. Ms. Vale, I'm going to ask you directly. Do you have any formal medical or forensic training that would qualify you to interpret the evidence you've presented? Brenna's pause was subtle but significant. For the first time, she seemed to be calculating how much truth she could reveal without compromising something larger. Your Honor, my qualifications have been verified by appropriate federal authorities. Federal authorities. The words hung in this courtroom like a revelation that would reshape everything that followed. Why would federal authorities be interested in verifying the qualifications of a county courthouse custodian? Unless she wasn't really a custodian at all. Defense Attorney Crenshaw seized on the opening with growing excitement. Ms. Vale, are you currently employed by any federal agency? I cannot comment on matters related to ongoing federal investigations, she replied, and the courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically as everyone began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a routine murder trial. Ongoing federal investigations, federal authorities, advanced forensic training. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that terrified Judge Thornfield and everyone involved in the conspiracy to frame Carlos Hernandez and protect the real killer of Keisha Washington. Antagonist court clerk Vera Blackwell was frantically taking notes, documenting what was clearly evolving into a federal case that would destroy the careers and freedom of everyone involved in the cover-up. Her commitment to maintaining established hierarchies was being challenged by revelations that would reshape the power structure of the entire county justice system. Mrs. Washington was sobbing with relief, finally understanding that someone with real authority was fighting for justice for her murdered daughter. Carlos Hernandez was staring at the witness stand in amazement, recognizing that his protests of innocence were finally being heard by someone with the power to act on them. But the most significant development was the growing realization that Brenna Vale possessed not only the knowledge to expose the truth about Keisha Washington's murder, but also the authority to ensure that those responsible would face appropriate consequences. What happened next would be studied in judicial ethics courses for decades as an example of how corrupt judges destroy themselves when confronted with evidence they cannot suppress or control. Judge Thornfield's response to the growing revelation of federal involvement would provide prosecutors with everything they needed to ensure his conviction on multiple felony charges. Judge Thornfield's voice rose to near shouting levels as his judicial composure completely disintegrated. I don't care what federal agencies you claim to represent, Ms. Vale. In my courtroom, I determine what evidence is admissible and what witnesses are qualified to testify. Your Honor, defense attorney Crenshaw interjected nervously, recognizing that his client's case was evolving into something far beyond a routine murder trial. If this witness represents federal law enforcement, perhaps we should consider a recess to clarify her status and ensure proper protocols are followed. There will be no recess, Thornfield snapped, his authority challenged in ways that revealed the corrupt foundation of his judicial power. This witness will answer questions about her alleged qualifications or be held in contempt. But Brenna's next response would begin the final demolition of the conspiracy that had denied justice to Keisha Washington and nearly cost Carlos Hernandez his life. Your Honor, my qualifications include federal certification in forensic pathology, advanced training in evidence analysis, and 14 months of investigation into systematic civil rights violations in this judicial district. 14 months. The number hit Judge Thornfield like a physical blow, revealing the scope of federal surveillance that had been documenting his pattern of corruption, bias, and obstruction of justice in murder cases involving minority victims. For over a year, federal agents had been building a comprehensive case against him. Dr. Morrison bolted toward the courtroom exit but found his path subtly blocked by individuals who had been positioned throughout the gallery. The federal presence was no longer concealed. Agents were moving into position to prevent the escape of key conspirators. Saboteur bailiff Rex Dalton moved aggressively toward the witness stand, attempting to use physical intimidation to suppress federal testimony. Your Honor, this witness needs to be removed from the courtroom immediately. She's disrupting proceedings with unauthorized federal intervention. But Brenna's response demonstrated that physical intimidation was not only ineffective but legally dangerous for anyone who attempted it. Officer Dalton, any attempt to interfere with federal testimony in a civil rights investigation would constitute additional federal charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 1512. She was citing federal criminal statutes with the precision of a prosecutor while maintaining the calm authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. Her body language remained relaxed despite the mounting hostility, suggesting extensive training in conflict de-escalation and threat assessment. Furthermore, Brenna continued relentlessly, the evidence tampering documented in this case represents systematic violation of federal civil rights law. The victim, Keisha Washington, was denied equal protection under law through deliberate falsification of forensic evidence designed to protect the real killer and frame an innocent man. Court clerk Vera Blackwell had stopped taking notes entirely, recognizing that she was witnessing the collapse of the entire county justice system. The social hierarchy she had spent decades maintaining was being demolished by federal authority that superseded all local power structures. Carlos Hernandez was staring at the witness stand in amazement, finally understanding that someone with real authority was fighting for his innocence. The months of despair and hopelessness were being replaced by the recognition that justice might actually be possible. Mrs. Washington had risen from her seat, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her daughter's death was finally being treated with the seriousness it deserved. For months, she had been told to accept justice that felt wrong, to trust a system that had failed Keisha from the beginning. Prosecutor Rex Dalton was frantically gathering files, clearly preparing to distance himself from what was obviously becoming a federal case. His career-long strategy of cooperating with judicial corruption was about to be exposed through comprehensive federal documentation. Judge Thornfield made his final, fatal error by attempting to use his judicial authority to suppress federal evidence. Ms. Vale, I'm ordering you to cease this testimony immediately. You will be held in contempt if you continue making unsubstantiated accusations against this court. Your Honor, Brenna replied with devastating calm that would later be cited in federal court proceedings. Attempting to suppress federal testimony in a civil rights investigation constitutes additional violations under 18 U.S.C. Section 1512, tampering with a witness in federal proceedings. The federal agents were now moving openly through the courtroom, taking positions that made it clear they were prepared for arrests. The gallery had fallen into stunned silence as everyone realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a sitting judge being confronted with evidence of his own crimes in his own courtroom. Technical challenger prosecutor Dale Merrick made a desperate attempt to salvage something from the situation. Your Honor, perhaps we should declare a mistrial and allow federal authorities to sort out these allegations through proper channels. There will be no mistrial, Thornfield shouted, his judicial composure completely destroyed. This is my courtroom, and I determine how proceedings will be conducted. But the federal authority superseding his local power was about to be demonstrated in the most dramatic way possible. The confrontation building in Courtroom 7 would soon escalate beyond anything Cook County's judicial system had ever witnessed. The stage was set for a revelation that would not only expose the truth about Keisha Washington's murder, but would also demonstrate the federal power to hold corrupt local officials accountable for denying constitutional rights to American citizens. Judge Thornfield was about to discover that federal authority, when properly exercised, supersedes all local corruption and judicial bias. And Brenna Vale was prepared to reveal exactly who she was and what authority she represented. The atmosphere in Courtroom 7 had reached a breaking point where something decisive had to happen. The federal presence was no longer concealed. Judge Thornfield's corruption was becoming undeniable, and Brenna Vale's true capabilities were emerging despite her continued operational constraints. But the most dramatic revelations were still to come. Federal oversight that had been quietly documenting proceedings for months was now positioned to intervene directly. Agents positioned throughout the gallery were no longer maintaining their cover as casual observers. Court security cameras were recording everything, creating permanent documentation of civil rights violations that would later be used in federal prosecutions. Dr. Morrison's attempt to coordinate with other conspirators was being systematically documented by federal surveillance. His whispered conferences with Prosecutor Dalton, his obvious attempts to signal Court Clerk Vera Blackwell, and his growing desperation were all being recorded as evidence of ongoing conspiracy to obstruct federal civil rights investigations. Your Honor, Brenna continued with methodical precision, the systematic pattern of evidence tampering in this case extends beyond isolated misconduct to deliberate denial of constitutional rights. The federal investigation has documented similar violations in multiple cases involving minority victims. Multiple cases. The scope of the federal investigation was becoming clear. This wasn't an isolated incident involving a single corrupt judge and a falsified murder case. This was comprehensive documentation of systematic civil rights violations affecting potentially hundreds of victims over many years. Mrs. Washington was beginning to understand that her daughter's case was part of something much larger. The justice that had been denied to Keisha was being denied to other families throughout Cook County through systematic corruption that protected the wealthy and powerful while sacrificing the innocent and vulnerable. Carlos Hernandez was realizing that his nightmare was finally ending. The federal authority that was emerging in this courtroom had the power to not only exonerate him but to ensure that those responsible for his wrongful prosecution would face appropriate consequences. But perhaps most significantly, the victim's family was getting answers to questions that had haunted them for months. Why had the investigation felt wrong? Why had the evidence seemed inconsistent? Why had justice felt incomplete? The federal documentation was providing systematic answers to all their concerns. Brenna's knowledge of federal procedures was becoming impossible to ignore or dismiss. When she referenced specific federal case law, her citations were precise and current. When she discussed evidence protocols, her familiarity was clearly based on extensive practical experience. When she maintained operational boundaries, her discipline suggested training in environments where security breaches could have life and death consequences. The Federal Forensic Laboratory has conducted independent analysis of all evidence in this case, she testified, producing documentation that would later prove crucial to federal prosecutions. The results contradict official findings in every significant aspect. Federal Forensic Laboratory, independent analysis. The resources being brought to bear on this case were far beyond anything available to local law enforcement. This was federal authority operating at the highest levels to ensure constitutional rights were protected. Murder cases can destroy families financially, which is why today's story is brought to you by Victim Shield Legal. When facing powerful opponents trying to cover up crimes, you need experienced criminal defense attorneys without crushing costs. Victim Shield provides unlimited legal consultation, expert witness coordination, and wrongful death representation for one monthly fee. Don't let killers escape justice due to money. Visit victimshield.com/justice for your first month free and get the legal protection families deserve. Judge Thornfield's response to mounting federal pressure was becoming increasingly desperate and self-incriminating. His attempts to suppress evidence, intimidate witnesses, and obstruct federal testimony were being documented as additional federal crimes that would multiply his eventual prison sentence. Court reporter Emma Sterling was creating a transcript that would become historical evidence of judicial corruption and federal intervention. Her documentation of every word, gesture, and procedural violation was building a comprehensive record that federal prosecutors would use to ensure convictions of all conspirators. The systematic nature of the federal investigation was becoming apparent through Brenna's carefully controlled revelations. This wasn't a spontaneous response to discovered corruption. This was the culmination of months of careful planning, systematic evidence collection, and comprehensive preparation for exactly this kind of confrontation. Defense attorney Wade Crenshaw was beginning to understand that his client was about to be exonerated through federal intervention that would expose corruption reaching into the highest levels of county government. His strategy shifted from defending against local charges to cooperating with federal investigation that would ensure justice for his wrongfully accused client. The federal evidence that Brenna was authorized to present painted a picture of corruption that reached far beyond individual misconduct to systematic institutional failure. The scope of documentation was staggering in its thoroughness and devastating in its implications for everyone involved in the conspiracy. The federal analysis reveals that crime scene evidence was systematically altered in 17 different cases over the past 3 years, Brenna testified, presenting documentation that exposed the full scope of judicial corruption. The pattern shows deliberate manipulation designed to achieve predetermined outcomes regardless of actual evidence. 17 cases, 3 years. The systematic nature of the corruption was becoming undeniable. This wasn't isolated misconduct but comprehensive institutional failure that had denied justice to dozens of victims while protecting criminals with political connections. The federal laboratory analysis that Brenna presented was devastating in its scientific precision. DNA evidence had been falsified, forensic reports had been systematically altered, and physical evidence had been deliberately destroyed to prevent independent verification. The corruption was comprehensive and professional, requiring coordination between multiple county officials. In the specific case of Keisha Washington, Brenna continued, the federal analysis confirms that the actual perpetrator was Bradley Morrison, son of medical examiner Dr. Clark Morrison. The evidence tampering was designed to protect Bradley Morrison while ensuring the conviction of Carlos Hernandez. The revelation sent shockwaves through the gallery. Dr. Morrison, who had been attempting to discredit federal testimony all day, was revealed as a father using his professional position to protect his murderer's son. His corruption had denied justice to Keisha Washington's family while nearly costing an innocent man his life. Mrs. Washington collapsed into her seat, overwhelmed by the revelation that her daughter's killer was being protected by the very officials who were supposed to ensure justice. The systematic betrayal of her trust was almost incomprehensible in its cruelty and corruption. Carlos Hernandez was vindicated in the most complete way possible. Not only was his innocence established through federal investigation, but the real killer had been identified through scientific analysis that couldn't be challenged or disputed. Judge Thornfield's pattern of protecting wealthy defendants while ensuring conviction of convenient scapegoats was being exposed through federal documentation that would guarantee his prosecution for systematic civil rights violations. His decades of corruption were finally being brought to light through comprehensive federal investigation. The federal evidence revealed coordination between multiple county officials in a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government. Court clerks, prosecutors, medical examiners, and judges had worked together to deny constitutional rights to minority victims while protecting political allies from accountability. But perhaps most significantly, the federal investigation was providing answers and accountability that local authorities had refused to deliver. The systematic denial of justice was being addressed through federal authority that could supersede local corruption and ensure constitutional rights were protected. Hold on. Her true identity is about to change everything you think you know about this murder case. Before we reveal who she really is, make sure you're subscribed because what's coming next will leave the entire courtroom speechless. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. The scope of the federal investigation was becoming clear through systematic revelation of evidence that had been gathered over months of careful surveillance. Federal agents had documented corruption, recorded conversations, and gathered physical evidence that would guarantee convictions of all conspirators. Brenna's role in the federal investigation was clearly more significant than her custodial cover had suggested. Her systematic knowledge, professional expertise, and operational authority indicated training and credentials far beyond anything associated with courthouse maintenance staff. The federal authority that was emerging in this courtroom represented the highest levels of law enforcement commitment to ensuring constitutional rights were protected. The resources being brought to bear on this case demonstrated federal determination to hold corrupt local officials accountable for denying equal justice under law. But the most dramatic revelations were still to come. Brenna Vale's true identity and the full scope of federal authority she represented would soon be revealed in ways that would transform not only this case but the entire foundation of judicial accountability in Cook County. The stage was set for confrontations that would expose the complete truth about Keisha Washington's murder while demonstrating the ultimate supremacy of federal authority over local corruption and institutional bias. Judge Thornfield was about to discover exactly who he had been threatening and what consequences awaited those who systematically denied constitutional rights to American citizens. The tension in Courtroom 7 had reached a level where even the air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Every person in the packed gallery sensed that something monumental was about to happen, though none could have imagined the scale of the revelation that was approaching. Judge Thornfield's desperation was becoming palpable, his judicial mask slipping further with each passing moment as he realized that his decades of corruption were about to be exposed in the most public way possible. Brenna Vale remained at the witness stand, her composed demeanor unchanged despite the mounting hostility directed at her. But something subtle had shifted in her bearing. The careful deference she had shown throughout the morning was being replaced by quiet authority that suggested someone accustomed to commanding respect rather than requesting it. Her systematic organization of documents, her precise responses to increasingly aggressive questioning, and her calm dismissal of intimidation tactics all pointed to training and experience far beyond anything associated with custodial work. "Ms. Vale," Judge Thornfield snarled, his voice carrying the full weight of his judicial authority and racial prejudice, "you have disrupted these proceedings long enough. I'm ordering you to cease this performance immediately and confine your testimony to matters within your actual competence." But Brenna's response carried an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor, my testimony is well within my competence and directly relevant to the systematic denial of constitutional rights that this court has perpetrated against minority victims." Constitutional rights. Systematic denial. The language of federal civil rights law was emerging more clearly in her responses, suggesting someone with extensive legal training and federal authority. Court reporter Emma Sterling's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word of what was clearly evolving into historical testimony. Antagonist court clerk Vera Blackwell made one final attempt to maintain the social hierarchy that was crumbling around her. "Your Honor, this witness is clearly exceeding her authority as courthouse maintenance staff. Perhaps she should be reminded of her proper place in these proceedings." "My proper place," Brenna replied with quiet authority, "is wherever the protection of constitutional rights requires my presence." The phrasing was revealing in its implications. Someone whose proper place was defined by constitutional protection rather than custodial duties. Someone whose presence was required for purposes that transcended routine courthouse maintenance. Someone with authority that superseded local judicial power. Mrs. Washington was gripping the edge of her seat, recognizing that this moment would define whether her daughter's death would ever receive real justice. The months of frustration and unanswered questions were culminating in this confrontation between a single black woman and the entire corrupt establishment that had failed Keisha. Carlos Hernandez watched in amazement as his fate hung in the balance. The federal authority that was emerging in this courtroom represented his only hope for freedom and vindication. His wrongful prosecution was about to be exposed through testimony that revealed the true scope of corruption in the county justice system. Federal agents positioned throughout the gallery were no longer maintaining any pretense of casual observation. Their strategic positions, professional alertness, and obvious preparation for escalation made it clear that they were expecting significant developments that would require immediate intervention. Dr. Morrison's desperation was becoming obvious to everyone in the courtroom. His attempts to coordinate with other conspirators were failing as federal surveillance documented every gesture and whispered conversation. His son's protection was crumbling as federal evidence systematically demolished the case against Carlos Hernandez. Defense attorney Wade Crenshaw recognized that his client's case was evolving far beyond routine criminal defense. The federal intervention that was emerging would not only exonerate Carlos, but would expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of county government. His strategy shifted to full cooperation with federal authorities, who clearly had resources and authority far beyond local jurisdiction. Prosecutor Rex Dalton was frantically trying to salvage something from a case that was disintegrating before his eyes. His cooperation with judicial corruption was being documented through federal surveillance that would later be used in his own prosecution. The plea deal he had been pressuring Carlos to accept would soon be revealed as part of a conspiracy to protect the real killer. Technical challenger prosecutor Dale Merrick made one final attempt to discredit the witness whose testimony was systematically demolishing their case. "Ms. Vale, you've made serious accusations against respected county officials. Do you have any understanding of the legal consequences of false testimony in federal proceedings?" "Prosecutor Merrick," Brenna replied with devastating calm, "I have extensive understanding of federal legal proceedings and the consequences faced by those who obstruct constitutional justice." Her knowledge of legal consequences wasn't theoretical. It carried the authority of someone who had participated in federal prosecutions, and understood exactly what awaited corrupt officials who systematically denied civil rights. The precision of her language suggested legal training that went far beyond casual familiarity. Judge Thornfield's final desperate attempt to maintain control revealed the full scope of his corruption. "I don't care what federal authority you claim to represent, Ms. Vale. This is my courtroom, my jurisdiction, my decision about what testimony is allowed." "Your Honor," Brenna replied with quiet finality, "federal constitutional authority supersedes local judicial power when civil rights are being violated." Federal constitutional authority. The phrase hung in the courtroom air like a revelation that would reshape everything that followed. Local judicial power was about to be superseded by federal intervention that would ensure constitutional rights were protected regardless of local corruption. Bailiff Rex Dalton moved aggressively toward the witness stand, attempting one final act of intimidation. "Your Honor, I recommend this witness be removed from the courtroom immediately for disrupting proceedings." But Brenna's response demonstrated that physical intimidation was not only ineffective, but legally dangerous for anyone who attempted it. "Officer Dalton, any interference with federal constitutional testimony would constitute additional federal crimes under multiple statutes." Her calm dismissal of physical threats suggested someone with extensive training in dangerous situations. Her body language remained relaxed despite mounting hostility, indicating confidence based on professional competence rather than bravado. The moment had arrived when something decisive had to happen. The federal presence could no longer remain concealed, the corruption could no longer be denied, and Brenna Vale's true identity could no longer be hidden behind her custodial cover. Judge Thornfield made the decision that would define his legacy and seal his fate. Reaching into his robes, he withdrew the service revolver that had been his symbol of ultimate authority for over 2 decades. The weapon had been intended to enforce his power over those who challenged his corruption. Now it would become evidence of federal crimes that would guarantee his life imprisonment. "I've had enough of this federal interference in my courtroom," Thornfield declared, pointing the weapon directly at Brenna's head as screams erupted throughout the gallery. "You want to play federal agent? Let's see how federal you are when faced with real judicial authority." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Mrs. Washington screamed in terror and outrage. Jurors dove for cover behind their seats. Gallery members scrambled for exits that were suddenly blocked by federal agents who had been waiting for exactly this escalation. But Brenna Vale didn't flinch. Her composure remained absolute, her hands steady, her voice calm as she spoke words that would be recorded in federal court transcripts and studied in constitutional law courses for decades to come. In the moment when Judge Marcus Thornfield's mask of judicial authority finally crumbled completely, when his service revolver pointed directly at the head of the woman who had exposed his corruption, when his racist hatred overcame any remaining pretense of legal professionalism, the truth that had been carefully concealed for 14 months was finally revealed in its full, devastating scope. "I've had enough of this lying, worthless cleaning woman making a mockery of my courtroom with her federal fantasies," Thornfield screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger as spittle flew from his lips. "You want to destroy everything I've built? You want to protect criminals and terrorists? Let's see how tough you are when you're bleeding out on my courtroom floor." The racist epithets poured from him in a torrent of hatred that revealed the true foundation of his judicial career. Every decision, every sentence, every ruling had been motivated by the same venomous prejudice that was now exposed for the entire world to witness. But instead of cowering in terror, instead of begging for mercy, instead of submitting to the racist authority that had oppressed so many before her, Brenna Vale calmly reached into her maintenance jacket and withdrew a leather credential case that would change everything everyone thought they knew about this case, this woman, and the power of federal justice. The gold badge that gleamed in the courtroom lights bore the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But it was the medical certification beside it that transformed understanding completely. This wasn't just a federal agent who had been conducting an undercover investigation. This was one of the most highly trained forensic pathologists in the United States, someone whose expertise was recognized at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. "Dr. Helena Marsh," she announced with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Supervisory Special Agent, Quantico Behavioral Analysis Unit, Forensic Pathology Division, assigned to Operation Truth Seeker, the comprehensive investigation into systematic civil rights violations and judicial corruption in Cook County, Illinois." The words fell like hammer blows on the stunned courtroom. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Supervisory Special Agent, Quantico Behavioral Analysis Unit, Forensic Pathology Division. Each credential represented years of training, extensive education, and federal authority that superseded every local official in the building. Dr. Helena Marsh, not Brenna Vale, custodial worker, Dr. Helena Marsh, one of the FBI's most experienced forensic pathologists, a woman whose expertise had been crucial to solving hundreds of federal cases, whose testimony had convicted murderers and child killers and terrorists across the United States. Judge Thornfield's hand began shaking violently as the full implications hit him like a physical blow. For 14 months, he had been committing federal crimes in the presence of one of the FBI's top investigators. Every racist comment, every corrupt decision, every act of judicial bias had been documented by someone with the training and authority to ensure federal prosecution. Your Honor, Dr. Marsh continued with devastating calm. For the past 14 months, I have been conducting a comprehensive federal investigation into systematic constitutional violations in this judicial district under direct authorization from the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Federal authorization. Comprehensive investigation. The scope of federal resources that had been brought to bear on Cook County corruption was becoming clear. This wasn't a local investigation that could be suppressed or corrupted. This was federal authority operating at the highest levels. The courtroom had fallen into absolute silence except for the sound of Mrs. Washington sobbing with relief and vindication. Her daughter's death was finally being addressed by someone with real authority, someone who couldn't be intimidated or corrupted or silenced by local political power. Every word spoken in this courtroom today has been recorded and transmitted in real time to federal prosecutors, Dr. Marsh testified as federal marshals moved into position throughout the gallery. The systematic denial of constitutional rights, the evidence tampering, the witness intimidation, all of it has been documented as evidence for federal prosecution. Real-time transmission, federal prosecutors. The technology and resources being employed were far beyond anything available to local law enforcement. This was federal authority operating with comprehensive surveillance and immediate communication to ensure that justice could not be denied or delayed. Carlos Hernandez was weeping openly as he realized that his nightmare was finally ending. The federal authority that had been revealed possessed both the power and the commitment to ensure that he would be exonerated completely. His months of despair were being replaced by the recognition that real justice was finally possible. But Dr. Marsh wasn't finished. Her revelation of the true scope of Operation Truthseeker would expose corruption that reached far beyond this single case into the systematic institutional failure that had denied justice to hundreds of victims. The evidence tampering you ordered in the Keisha Washington murder case violates 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, destruction of evidence and federal investigation. Well, she continued with prosecutorial precision. The systematic intimidation of witnesses violates 18 U.S.C. Section 1512, tampering with witnesses in federal proceedings. The systematic denial of due process rights to minority defendants violates 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, federal criminal statutes, multiple violations, life imprisonment charges. Judge Thornfield was facing the rest of his life in federal prison for crimes that had been systematically documented by one of the FBI's most experienced investigators. Morrison bolted for the courtroom exit but found federal agents waiting to take him into custody. His medical license would be revoked, his freedom would end, and his son would face murder charges that could no longer be avoided through corruption and cover-up. Court clerk Vera Blackwell sat in stunned silence as her carefully constructed social hierarchy crumbled around her. The institutional power she had spent decades maintaining was being superseded by federal authority that recognized only constitutional rights and equal justice under law. Furthermore, Dr. Marsh testified as the full scope of federal evidence was revealed. Operation Truthseeker has documented similar constitutional violations in 47 additional cases over the past 3 years, involving systematic discrimination against minority victims and protection of politically connected defendants. 47 cases. 3 years. The systematic nature of the corruption was staggering in its scope and devastating in its implications for everyone involved. Federal prosecutors would have hundreds of felony charges to file against dozens of county officials. But the most dramatic moment was still approaching. Judge Thornfield, his hand still shaking as he pointed his service weapon at the head of an FBI supervisory special agent, was about to make the final error that would guarantee his conviction on charges of attempting to murder a federal officer. Federal marshals were positioned throughout the courtroom, their weapons drawn, their voices coordinating through secure communication channels. The situation had escalated to federal law enforcement's highest priority: protecting an agent under direct threat while documenting crimes that would ensure maximum prosecution. Judge Marcus Thornfield, Dr. Marsh said with the authority of someone who had testified in federal court hundreds of times, "You are currently committing additional federal crimes that will be added to the charges already filed against you. I strongly recommend that you surrender your weapon immediately and submit to federal custody." But Thornfield's racist hatred had consumed whatever remained of his rational judgment. His response would provide federal prosecutors with everything they needed to ensure he never saw freedom again. Judge Thornfield's finger tightened on the trigger as his final words as a sitting judge revealed the full depth of his corruption and hatred. "I don't care if you're FBI, CIA, or the president herself. No federal agency is going to destroy what I've built in my county. You're just another lying black woman who needs to learn her place." The racist epithets that followed were so venomous that several jurors gasped in shock. This was the man who had presided over hundreds of cases involving minority defendants, whose judicial decisions had determined the fates of countless families, whose corruption had denied justice to victims across Cook County for decades. But before he could complete his threat, before he could fire the weapon that would have ended Dr. Helena Marsh's life and silenced the federal investigation forever, the courtroom doors exploded inward as a federal tactical team that had been positioned outside for exactly this contingency stormed the chamber with military precision. "FBI, drop your weapon! Drop your weapon now!" Federal Marshal Elena Torres led the team that surrounded Judge Thornfield within seconds, their weapons trained on him from multiple angles, their commands echoing through the courtroom with the authority of federal law enforcement operating at maximum priority. "Judge Marcus Thornfield, you are under arrest for attempted murder of a federal officer, systematic deprivation of civil rights under color of law, obstruction of federal investigations, conspiracy to deny constitutional rights, and violation of your oath of office," Torres announced as Thornfield's weapon clattered to the floor and he collapsed to his knees behind the bench. The handcuffs that closed around his wrists marked the end of a judicial career built on corruption and racism. The man who had wielded absolute power over the lives and freedom of others was now facing life imprisonment in federal prison. Understanding forensic science can mean the difference between justice and cover-ups. That's why we're partnering with Masterclass to recommend their forensic pathology and criminal investigation courses. Learn from expert medical examiners and FBI forensic specialists who've solved thousands of murder cases. Understanding how evidence works protects you and your loved ones. Visit masterclass.com/forensics for 50% off an annual membership and start protecting yourself with scientific knowledge. Dr. Marsh remained in the witness stand, her composure absolute despite having faced imminent death from a corrupt judge's weapon. Her federal training and experience had prepared her for exactly this kind of confrontation, and her testimony would continue despite the dramatic arrest that was unfolding around her. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she addressed the 12 citizens who sat in stunned amazement, "what you have witnessed today represents the culmination of the most comprehensive federal civil rights investigation in Cook County history." Federal civil rights investigation. The scope and significance of what had been revealed was beginning to sink in for everyone present. This wasn't just the exposure of corruption in a single case. This was federal documentation of systematic institutional failure that had denied justice to hundreds of victims. Mrs. Washington was sobbing with relief and vindication as she realized that her daughter's death was finally being addressed with the seriousness it deserved. The federal authority that had been revealed possessed both the power and the commitment to ensure that Keisha's killer would face appropriate consequences. Carlos Hernandez was officially exonerated as Dr. Marsh presented the federal forensic evidence that proved his complete innocence. The DNA analysis, fingerprint evidence, and advanced blood pattern reconstruction had identified Bradley Morrison as the actual killer with scientific certainty that could not be challenged or disputed. The Federal Forensic Laboratory at Quantico has conducted comprehensive analysis of all evidence in this case, Dr. Marsh testified as federal agents secured the courtroom. The results prove conclusively that Carlos Hernandez is innocent of all charges and that evidence was systematically falsified to frame him for a murder committed by Bradley Morrison. Federal Forensic Laboratory, Quantico. Comprehensive analysis. The resources that had been brought to bear on this investigation were far beyond anything available to local law enforcement. This was federal science operating at the highest levels to ensure that truth could not be suppressed or corrupted. The federal arrest warrants that were being executed throughout the courthouse would sweep up everyone involved in the conspiracy. Dr. Clark Morrison was taken into custody as he attempted to destroy evidence in his office. Court Clerk Vera Blackwell was arrested at her desk as federal agents seized files documenting years of coordination with corrupt judges. Prosecutor Rex Dalton surrendered himself to federal custody, recognizing that cooperation with the investigation represented his only hope for reduced sentencing. His participation in the conspiracy to frame Carlos Hernandez had been comprehensively documented through federal surveillance. Defense attorney Wade Crenshaw was not charged, as his representation of Carlos Hernandez had been competent within the constraints of the corrupted system. Federal prosecutors recognized that defense attorneys could not be held responsible for institutional corruption that pervaded the entire justice system. The federal grand jury that had been secretly convened months earlier was prepared to issue indictments against 23 county officials on charges ranging from civil rights violations to conspiracy to commit murder. The scope of corruption that had been documented was staggering in its breadth and systematic in its execution. Bradley Morrison, the actual killer of Keisha Washington, was arrested at Chicago O'Hare International Airport as he attempted to flee the country. Federal agents had been monitoring his movements for months, waiting for the optimal moment to take him into custody without jeopardizing the larger investigation. The federal oversight that would be imposed on Cook County's justice system would ensure that systematic civil rights violations could never again occur on this scale. Federal monitors would review all cases. Federal prosecutors would have jurisdiction over civil rights matters, and federal courts would supervise the reconstruction of institutional integrity. But perhaps most significantly, the families of victims who had been denied justice through systematic corruption would finally receive answers and accountability. The federal investigation had identified dozens of wrongful convictions, falsified evidence, and covered-up crimes that would now be addressed through comprehensive federal intervention. The transformation of Cook County's justice system from corrupt local institution to federally supervised constitutional protector would serve as a model for civil rights enforcement throughout the United States. Operation Truthseeker had demonstrated that federal authority, when properly applied, could overcome any level of local corruption. Dr. Helena Marsh's 14 months of undercover investigation had exposed institutional failure that had denied constitutional rights to hundreds of citizens. Her scientific expertise, federal authority, and personal courage had ensured that justice would finally be delivered to victims who had been abandoned by the very system sworn to protect them. The courtroom that had witnessed decades of corruption was transformed into the birthplace of constitutional accountability. Judge Thornfield's racist hatred and judicial bias had been replaced by federal commitment to equal justice under law. As federal agents completed the arrests and secured evidence that would ensure convictions, Mrs. Washington approached Dr. Marsh with tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "Thank you for not giving up on my daughter," she whispered. "Thank you for making sure she mattered." Dr. Marsh's response captured the essence of federal commitment to constitutional rights. "Every victim matters, Mrs. Washington. Every family deserves justice. Every citizen is entitled to equal protection under law." The federal authority that had been revealed in Courtroom 7 represented the highest ideals of American justice. That constitutional rights supersede local corruption. That federal power exists to protect the powerless. And that truth and science will ultimately triumph over prejudice and institutional failure. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago became the center of national attention as Operation Truthseeker concluded with the most comprehensive civil rights prosecution in Illinois history. The scope of charges filed against Cook County officials was staggering. 23 defendants facing a combined total of 147 federal felonies, ranging from civil rights violations to conspiracy to commit murder. Judge Marcus Thornfield, once the most powerful judicial figure in Cook County, sat in federal detention awaiting trial on charges that would guarantee life imprisonment without possibility of parole. His attempted murder of FBI Supervisory Special Agent Dr. Helena Marsh had been recorded from multiple angles, providing federal prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of his violent racism and complete corruption. The federal proceedings that followed would rewrite the standards for judicial accountability throughout the United States. Marsh's testimony before the federal grand jury lasted 17 hours over 3 days, presenting evidence that documented systematic constitutional violations affecting over 400 cases during Thornfield's tenure. The systematic denial of due process rights to minority defendants represents one of the most comprehensive civil rights violations we have ever prosecuted, announced federal prosecutor Sterling Knox during a press conference that drew national media coverage. The evidence collected during Operation Truthseeker demonstrates institutional racism so pervasive that federal oversight will be required for years to come. Think this murder trial showdown was unbelievable? Wait until you hear about the corrupt medical examiner who thought he could fake autopsy reports, until a grieving mother's secret medical background exposed his deadly lies. Click here to watch that incredible story unfold. Mrs. Diana Washington stood beside federal prosecutors during the announcement, her dignity and strength serving as a powerful reminder of the human cost of judicial corruption. "My daughter Keisha deserved justice from the beginning," she stated with quiet authority. Dr. Marsh and the federal investigation ensured that her death would not be forgotten or covered up. Carlos Hernandez was not only exonerated but received a formal apology from the federal government for the constitutional violations he had endured. His wrongful prosecution had cost him 8 months of freedom and nearly his life, representing one of the most egregious examples of the systematic corruption that Operation Truthseeker had exposed. The federal settlement that compensated Carlos for his wrongful imprisonment totaled $4.7 million, though no amount of money could restore the months of terror he had experienced while facing execution for a crime he did not commit. His case became a national symbol of the importance of federal oversight in protecting constitutional rights. Dr. Clark Morrison pled guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for testimony against other conspirators, though his cooperation could not save him from the loss of his medical license and a minimum of 15 years in federal prison. His son, Bradley Morrison, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The federal oversight imposed on Cook County's justice system was comprehensive and permanent. Federal monitors would review all felony cases for evidence of bias or corruption. Federal prosecutors would have concurrent jurisdiction over all civil rights matters. Federal courts would supervise the reconstruction of institutional integrity that had been systematically destroyed over decades. Court clerk Vera Blackwell received a sentence of 8 years in federal prison for her role in coordinating the cover-up of multiple cases. Her commitment to maintaining social hierarchy had made her an active participant in denying constitutional rights to minority victims. Prosecutor Rex Dalton's cooperation with federal investigators earned him a reduced sentence of 12 years. Though his legal career ended permanently, his participation in the conspiracy to frame Carlos Hernandez had violated every ethical standard of prosecutorial conduct. The federal investigation expanded beyond Cook County to examine similar patterns of corruption in other Illinois judicial districts. Dr. Marsh was assigned to lead a new federal task force dedicated to identifying and prosecuting systematic civil rights violations throughout the Midwest. The reforms implemented in Cook County became a national model for federal civil rights enforcement. The systematic documentation of institutional racism provided federal prosecutors with tools and precedents that would be used to combat similar corruption throughout the United States. But perhaps most significantly, the families of victims who had been denied justice through systematic corruption finally received acknowledgement and compensation for their suffering. Federal victim compensation programs provided both financial support and official recognition that their loved ones had mattered. The federal civil rights charges that were filed against all conspirators carried mandatory minimum sentences that ensured none would be eligible for parole for decades. The message was clear. Federal authority would protect constitutional rights regardless of local political power or institutional resistance. National media coverage of Operation Truthseeker sparked congressional hearings on the need for expanded federal oversight of local judicial systems. The systematic nature of the corruption in Cook County was recognized as a warning about similar problems that might exist in other jurisdictions. Dr. Helena Marsh received the Federal Bureau of Investigation's highest commendation for her courage and expertise in conducting the undercover investigation that exposed institutional corruption. Her 14 months of work had not only solved individual cases but had transformed an entire justice system. The federal courthouse where Judge Thornfield had once wielded corrupt power was renamed the Keisha Washington Federal Justice Center, ensuring that the young woman's memory would inspire future generations of federal civil rights enforcement. 6 months after the dramatic conclusion of Operation Truthseeker, Cook County's justice system was operating under comprehensive federal oversight that had transformed every aspect of criminal proceedings. The changes were visible in courtrooms where federal monitors ensured that constitutional rights were protected and judicial bias was eliminated. Federal Judge Diana Westbrook, appointed to supervise the reconstruction of Cook County's justice system, issued quarterly reports documenting the progress toward constitutional compliance. The systematic changes required years to implement fully, but early indicators suggested that federal oversight was successfully eliminating the institutional racism that had pervaded local courts. The transformation we've seen in Cook County demonstrates that federal intervention can successfully restore constitutional rights even in systems with decades of corruption, Judge Westbrook announced during a federal review hearing. However, permanent change requires continued vigilance and long-term federal supervision. The federal monitoring that was established included real-time review of all judicial proceedings, mandatory bias training for all court personnel, and federal prosecution of any attempts to return to previous patterns of discrimination. The oversight was comprehensive and designed to prevent any regression to the corruption that Operation Truth Seeker had exposed. Dr. Helena Marsh continued her federal assignment, now leading a national task force that investigated similar patterns of judicial corruption throughout the United States. Her expertise in undercover investigation and forensic pathology made her uniquely qualified to expose institutional racism wherever it existed. The federal victim compensation program that was established has provided both financial support and official acknowledgement to families who had been denied justice through systematic corruption. Mrs. Washington became an advocate for other families, helping them navigate federal procedures and ensuring their voices were heard. Carlos Hernandez used his settlement to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting wrongfully convicted individuals and their families. His experience with systematic corruption motivated him to ensure that others would receive the federal protection that had saved his life. The federal grand jury continued meeting to consider additional charges against county officials whose corruption had been documented during Operation Truth Seeker. The investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic constitutional violations that would require years to prosecute fully. Federal prosecutors estimated that complete resolution of all cases affected by Cook County corruption would require 3 to 5 years of continued investigation and prosecution. The scope of institutional failure was so comprehensive that federal intervention would be necessary for the foreseeable future. The national attention focused on Cook County had inspired federal investigations in other jurisdictions where similar patterns of corruption were suspected. Dr. Marsh's task force was coordinating with federal prosecutors across the country to identify and address systematic civil rights violations. However, the victory achieved through Operation Truth Seeker was recognized as partial and temporary. Federal prosecutors acknowledged that institutional racism was a national problem requiring sustained federal commitment and resources that exceeded what had been applied to Cook County. The federal oversight that protected constitutional rights in Cook County was dependent on continued political support and federal funding that could potentially be reduced or eliminated by future administrations less committed to civil rights enforcement. Local resistance to federal oversight continued from officials who had not been prosecuted but who resented federal supervision of what they considered local judicial matters. The cultural and institutional changes required for permanent reform would take decades to achieve fully. Community organizations that had been established to monitor federal oversight and advocate for continued reform recognized that constant vigilance would be required to prevent any return to the systematic corruption that had denied justice for so many years. The federal protection that ensured constitutional rights in Cook County represented a significant victory for civil rights enforcement, but it also highlighted the ongoing need for federal resources and authority to combat institutional racism throughout the American justice system. 1 year after Judge Thornfield's arrest and the conclusion of Operation Truth Seeker, Dr. Helena Marsh was working in her federal office at the FBI's Chicago field headquarters when an encrypted email arrived that would change everything she thought she knew about the scope of judicial corruption in America. The message came through secure federal channels used only for the most sensitive intelligence communications. The sender was identified only as Deep Justice, a designation that didn't appear in any FBI database. The subject line read, Phase 2, Federal Judicial Network, Eyes Only. Dr. Marsh opened the message with growing concern. The Cook County investigation had been comprehensive and successful, but the suggestion that it represented only Phase 1 of a larger investigation was troubling in its implications. The encrypted document that accompanied the email contained federal case numbers and judicial district identifiers that suggested corruption far beyond what Operation Truth Seeker had exposed. References to federal circuit coordination and Supreme Court oversight compromise indicated that the institutional racism Dr. Marsh had documented in Cook County was part of a national network. Dr. Marsh, the message read, the Cook County corruption you exposed was the entry point to a network of federal judicial corruption that reaches the highest levels of the American justice system. Judge Thornfield was a local operator in a national conspiracy that has been systematically denying constitutional rights for decades. Federal judicial corruption, national conspiracy. The implications were staggering in their scope and terrifying in their potential impact on American democracy. If federal courts themselves were compromised, then the constitutional protections that Dr. Marsh had fought to defend might be systematically undermined at every level. The document included references to federal appellate judges in the 4th, 5th, and 9th circuits who had allegedly coordinated decisions to protect institutional racism while maintaining the appearance of constitutional compliance. The systematic nature of the alleged conspiracy suggested coordination that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Most disturbing of all were references to Supreme Court-level coordination that suggested even the nation's highest judicial authority might be compromised. The possibility that systematic corruption could reach the Supreme Court represented a threat to the constitutional foundation of American democracy. Dr. Marsh immediately initiated federal security protocols, ensuring that the encrypted communication was properly documented and transmitted to her supervisors through channels designed for the most sensitive intelligence. If the allegations contained in the message were accurate, they would require federal investigation at the highest classification levels. But even as she followed federal protocols for reporting potential national security threats, Dr. Marsh was troubled by questions that the mysterious communication raised. Who was Deep Justice? How had they obtained information about federal judicial corruption? What evidence supported allegations of such comprehensive constitutional violation? The federal investigation that had consumed 14 months of her life and nearly cost her her life was potentially just the beginning of a much larger exposure of institutional corruption. The thought that her courage in confronting Judge Thornfield's racism might have revealed only the surface of a national conspiracy was both inspiring and terrifying. As Dr. Marsh prepared to brief federal supervisors on the implications of the encrypted message, her secure phone rang with an incoming call from a number that appeared nowhere in federal databases. The caller identification showed only constitutional authority, another designation that suggested federal involvement at the highest classification levels. Dr. Marsh, the voice said when she answered. We've been monitoring your work on Operation Truth Seeker. Your exposure of Cook County corruption has provided us with the evidence we needed to move to the next phase of constitutional protection. Constitutional protection. Next phase. The language suggested that her investigation had been part of a larger federal operation that she had been unaware of during her undercover assignment. Who is this? Dr. Marsh asked, her FBI training taking over as she attempted to identify the source of the call. Someone who has been fighting institutional racism at the federal level for longer than you can imagine, the voice replied. The corruption you exposed in Cook County is connected to a network of federal judges who have been systematically undermining constitutional rights for decades. Are you prepared to take this investigation to its logical conclusion? Federal judges, systematic undermining, constitutional rights. The scope of the alleged conspiracy was beyond anything Dr. Marsh had imagined during her investigation of local corruption. What logical conclusion, Omoa? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The Supreme Court, Dr. Marsh. We have evidence that institutional racism has compromised the highest judicial authority in the United States. The question is whether you're prepared to investigate corruption that reaches into the very foundation of American constitutional democracy. The call ended before Dr. Marsh could respond, leaving her with questions that would transform her understanding of the federal justice system she had devoted her career to protecting. The courage she had shown in confronting Judge Thornfield's racism might be only the beginning of a much larger battle for the soul of American democracy. The encrypted files on her computer contained federal case numbers that would require the highest security clearance to access. The investigation that had nearly cost her life in a Cook County courtroom was potentially just the entry point to corruption that threatened the constitutional foundation of the United States. As Dr. Helena Marsh prepared to brief her supervisors on developments that could reshape federal law enforcement, she understood that her fight for constitutional rights was far from over. The systematic racism she had exposed in Cook County was apparently part of a national conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American government. The federal authority that had protected her during Operation Truth Seeker would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The institutional racism that had denied justice to Keisha Washington and hundreds of other victims was potentially just one manifestation of corruption that threatened the constitutional rights of every American citizen. But Dr. Marsh was ready for whatever came next. Her commitment to constitutional justice was absolute. Her FBI training was comprehensive, and her courage had been tested in the most dangerous circumstances. Whatever conspiracy existed at the federal level would face the same systematic exposure that had brought down Judge Thornfield and the Cook County corruption network. The fight for American democracy was just beginning, and Dr. Helena Marsh would be at the center of a battle that would determine whether constitutional rights could survive institutional racism at the highest levels of federal power. The phone rang again. This time she was ready. Mrs. Diana Washington stood in the Keisha Washington Federal Justice Center reading the bronze plaque that honored her daughter's memory. The federal courthouse that had once been a symbol of corruption and racial injustice had been transformed into a beacon of constitutional rights and equal protection under law. She would have been proud, Mrs. Washington whispered, touching the plaque that bore her daughter's name. She would have been proud that her death led to justice for so many others. The bronze inscription gleamed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the renovated courthouse windows. Keisha Michelle Washington, 1999 to 2024. Her pursuit of justice transformed a nation's commitment to constitutional rights. Below the words, an engraved scale of justice stood balanced, flanked by the words, equal protection under law, in both English and Spanish, reflecting the diverse community that now trusted this institution to deliver fair treatment regardless of race, ethnicity, or economic status. Dr. Helena Marsh, now director of the Federal Constitutional Rights Task Force, approached with quiet respect. The months since Operation Truthseeker had aged her in ways that went beyond the passage of time. The responsibility of leading a national investigation into judicial corruption had tested her resolve daily, but her commitment to constitutional justice remained unwavering. Mrs. Washington, your daughter's case changed everything. The investigation that began with her murder has exposed corruption throughout the federal system. The transformation had been more comprehensive than anyone could have imagined. What started as the investigation of a single corrupt judge had revealed a network of institutional racism that stretched across multiple states and judicial districts. Federal prosecutors were now handling cases in 17 different jurisdictions, where similar patterns of corruption had been documented. "And it's not over, is it?" Mrs. Washington asked, recognizing the continued determination in Dr. Marsh's eyes. She had learned to read the subtle signs of ongoing federal operations in the woman who had risked her life to expose the truth about Keisha's death. "No," Dr. Marsh replied with quiet authority. "It's not over, but we're going to finish what Keisha started. Constitutional rights will be protected regardless of how high the corruption reaches." The encrypted files that had arrived on Dr. Marsh's desk over recent months painted a picture of systematic constitutional violations that reached into federal appellate courts and beyond. The network that had protected Bradley Morrison's murder of Keisha Washington was connected to similar conspiracies that had denied justice to thousands of victims across the United States. Mrs. Washington had become more than a grieving mother seeking justice for her daughter. She now served as a federal victim advocate, helping other families navigate the complex process of federal civil rights enforcement. Her office in the federal building was just down the hall from Dr. Marsh's, symbolizing the partnership between affected communities and federal authority that had made Operation Truthseeker so successful. "The families we've helped over the past year," Mrs. D. Washington continued, gesturing toward the memorial wall that now honored all victims of judicial corruption. "They deserve to know that this fight will continue until every corrupt official is held accountable." The memorial wall displayed photographs and brief biographies of 47 victims whose cases had been corrupted by the network that Dr. Marsh had exposed. Young faces and old, men and women, representing every ethnic background found in Cook County and beyond. Each represented a family that had been denied justice through systematic institutional failure. The federal investigation that had begun in Cook County was now national in scope, with Dr. Marsh leading efforts to expose institutional racism wherever it existed in the American justice system. Her task force included FBI agents, federal prosecutors, forensic specialists, and community advocates working together to ensure that constitutional rights were protected at every level of government. The courage she had shown in confronting Judge Thornfield's corruption was now being applied to challenges that reached the highest levels of federal power. Congressional hearings had been scheduled to examine the scope of judicial corruption that Operation Truthseeker had revealed. Federal legislation was being drafted to strengthen oversight of local judicial systems and provide additional resources for civil rights enforcement. But the foundation had been laid in Courtroom 7, where a single black woman in maintenance workers' clothing had faced down racist hatred with scientific truth and federal authority. The institutional change that followed would ensure that Keisha Washington's death had meaning and that her memory would inspire constitutional justice for generations to come. The renovated courthouse now served as a training center for federal civil rights investigators from across the United States. Dr. Marsh's undercover investigation had become a case study in how to expose institutional corruption while protecting the safety of federal agents and community members who risked everything to support constitutional justice. "Dr. Marsh," Mrs. Washington said as they stood together before her daughter's memorial, "I want you to know that Keisha would have admired your courage. She believed that truth always wins in the end, even when it takes longer than we hope. The fight for American democracy continued, but the victory achieved through Operation Truthseeker proved that courage, truth, and federal authority could overcome any level of corruption or institutional racism. Dr. Helena Marsh was ready for whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that constitutional rights were worth any risk and any sacrifice. The secure phone in Dr. Marsh's pocket vibrated with an incoming encrypted message. Another case, another challenge, another opportunity to ensure that every American citizen received equal protection under law. The network of corruption that had seemed so powerful in Cook County was crumbling under federal pressure applied systematically across multiple jurisdictions. But as Dr. Marsh reached for the phone, she paused to look once more at Keisha Washington's memorial. The young woman's smile reminded her that this fight was about more than federal authority or legal precedent. It was about ensuring that every family could trust the justice system to protect their loved ones and hold accountable those who violated their constitutional rights. Dr. Helena Marsh answered the call, ready to continue the fight for constitutional justice that would define the future of American democracy. Keisha's legacy lived on in every case that was resolved fairly, every corrupt official who was held accountable, and every family that received the justice they deserved.